Let's start with the oral cavity. I know this is about the esophagus and the stomach, but let's start with the oral cavity. We've got the oral cavity here. We can see the tongue. So food is coming in this direction, where the teeth are going to be chewing, going to be breaking down this food into ever smaller portions. And we can see that within the oral cavity, this process of cutting and chewing, this mechanical digestion has started. This mixes with saliva, allowing the chemical digestion to start as well. And then during the process of swallowing, this food is passed into the pharynx, which we can see here. Remember I said the trachea is anterior, so here we've got our neck, and we can see the trachea is anteriorly, and directly behind the trachea we see the esophagus, which is running down in this direction. So the food is converted to this bolus, which is swallowed into the esophagus via the pharynx. It's then going to descend through the thorax and pierces the diaphragm. And for food to pass down through the esophagus, the muscular walls of the esophagus contract, and peristalsis carries that food inferiorly. So here we've got another view of the esophagus, its position within the thorax, and we can see anteriorly that it's impossible to see the esophagus with the stomach in position. And here I've highlighted in this anterior view the position of where the esophagus would be. If we look at the posterior view, then we can see the diaphragm here. We can see the outline of the posterior aspect of the heart here, sitting on the diaphragm. And we can see this large blood vessel here, that is our aorta. And we can see running inferiorly down, we have our esophagus. It's running directly behind the posterior surface of the heart. And then it's going to enter into the abdomen by passing through the diaphragm. And it passes through the diaphragm, as we'll come to see, at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. We can see that here. If we just briefly look at the blood supply to the esophagus, this really comes from esophageal branches directly from the aorta. The aorta is running alongside the esophagus in the thorax, and small branches come away from the aorta to supply the esophagus, which we can see here. The esophagus then pierces through the diaphragm at what I said was the 10th thoracic vertebral level, and then it quickly joins into the stomach at the esophagocardiac junction, and this occurs at about the 11th thoracic vertebral level. So we can see the esophagus within the thorax, penetrating the diaphragm, enter the abdomen to then be continuous with the stomach. So here we can see that in more detail. We can see we have the diaphragm here. We've got a slightly elevated diaphragm. The right dome is slightly elevated on the right because of the liver. And we can see that going through the diaphragm, we have three important apertures. We have one for the inferior vena cava, the so-called caval opening. That occurs at the level of T8. We then have the aorta that passes through the diaphragm. We've got the thoracic aorta passing through the diagram. On this inferior view, we can see it here, aorta passing through. This occurs at T12, level of the 12th thoracic vertebra. Here's our caval opening occurring at T8, the 8th thoracic vertebral level. And then we can see we've got our esophageal hiatus, which enables the esophagus to pass through. And that occurs at T10, the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. So inferior vena cava T8, esophagus T12, aorta at T. So the inferior vena cava at T8, the esophagus at T10, and the aorta at T12.